I'm joined now by Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, a risk analyst and a former diplomat. Doc, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. How did you make sense of President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership during South Africa's G20 presidency? And how do you think it enhanced our country's international standing despite our own domestic challenges?
Katako, good morning. I think South Africa handled the G20 very well. It was overwhelmingly successful in terms of the negotiation. It's quite complex to negotiate with countries that have divergent political and ideological differences and managed to get some consensus. So that was a big achievement for South Africa agenda. But also in terms of the logistics, the hosting, because the naysayers were expecting to see an incident that will take the focus away from Nasrec to peripheral issues. South Africa has done very well. The biggest concern, of course, from some of us was that you don't get any security incident that will send a negative message around the world. That was done very well. And I think the country has done very well. But the challenge, Katako, begins now. The implementation of what was decided there. And also for South Africa to start prioritizing what are issues that can be done. Because remember, a consensus agreement is not a perfect agreement. There may be issues in this agreement that South Africa doesn't agree with because it accommodates other member states. So it's to start distilling what is crucial for the South African presidency to implement moving forward. And I think that's where we are. And I think before the handover, South Africa would have gone through these details.
And I mean, when you speak about moving forward and what we need to look forward to in the future, I mean, President of Brazil emphasized that multilateralism would prevail despite the US's efforts to undermine it. How do you see the future of multilateralism in the context of emerging global powers and the US diplomacy?
Katlego, you know, the elephant in the room at Nasrec was the multipolarity, this new world order that is emerging. That actually a very good Italian philosopher once described it as the old order, it's dead, and the new order is struggling to be born. And that was made some years ago, more than 8 years ago. Now you're getting the same argument becoming relevant. So the definition of the new order is what is creating challenges, this multipolar world. What are those poles and how are they going to interface with each other? And the friction is then reflected in multilateral institutions because different constituencies within these multilateral institutions, they posture to articulate and advance their views. And that's why you're going to find this tension. It's a normal tension that must be there, but there must be some level of coexistence and understanding these tensions must exist together. It would have been lovely, Katlego, for the summit to discuss this notion of multipolarity. What does it mean? And to start defining parameters. But the fact of the matter is that the biggest unipolar world was not there. The United States, the biggest power, was not there. It would have been useful for them to be there. But this discussion will continue. Multipolarity is discussed by anyone else but the government. It's avoiding a discussion on this matter. And that would actually define the future of multilateralism and what are the issues that are of common interest, not ideological interest, but of common interest. But unfortunately, is the nature of the beast that we're dealing with, and we have to interface with this as we move forward.
And what did you make of the summit's address when it comes to some of those economic challenges, particularly those that are faced by emerging markets like South Africa, especially regarding climate financing and infrastructure development?
You know, Katlego, I'm still, even as we are talking, going through this agreement. I think I'm reading it for the 4th time now. But the buzzwords that you look for in this kind of agreement, you look where it says we note, you look where it says we affirm, you look where it says we commend. So those are the words that are really meaning something else, and they tell you about the level of divergence that emerge around the discussion on these issues. One thing that came out very clear to me it's around the financial part of the document. I think it's about paragraph 66 or paragraph 62 to paragraph 70. That is quite clear in terms of the commitment, what it reaffirms the financial institutions, the debt burden. But the challenge that we're seeing, there's no commitment, it seems, to start reforming the Bretton Woods institution. They're still dilly-dallying around that. But South Africa also did very well to bring a panel of experts to really look into this question of inequality that persists. And that's what is bedeviling the world. The Gen Z, which are becoming very restless, and rightfully so, that the resources are not trickling down to them, that they are left out in the development. They were not part of this discussion, even though the youth were approached. But there's a specific phenomenon that is starting to emerge called the Gen Z that is very restless, quite quick to demonstrate and mobilize huge numbers to topple government. So there's no discussion around this issue. So I think we're going to see these tensions going ahead. The global economy, it's not growing as we all may want to. The national debt, it's a huge problem. What it's called the public sector debt, which stands at 122 trillion for an economy that is growing at almost the same amount, $122 trillion, the global economy. But the biggest problem, Katleho, is the overall global debt, including what me and you owe as debt, mortgage, whatever it is, that is 333 trillion. So you can see we're going to bequeath to next generation a very high debt. And the biggest country with a high debt, the United States, was unfortunately not there. And the United States, in my own view, would keep on playing a fundamental role in the defining of this new world order of multipolarity. Without the United States, it's going to be a huge challenge. The United States has the capability to underwrite any global system together with new emerging powers. So that's one thing that we need to ensure that as we move forward, the cohesion is built within the G20 in terms of bringing all resources, all intellectual knowledges in defining what works better for the world.
I mean, you speak about that inequality report, and that committee was chaired by Prof. Stiglitz, and it was the first time in any G20 conversation that there ever was a committee put together regarding inequality. And it's quite worrying, as you mentioned, that a certain generation, a generation that we are looking to take the world forward, doesn't participate in some of these conversations that really impact what the world would look like for them in the near future.
Quite correct. That's why I'm saying all multilateral institutions now, their credibility depends on how they take into account the views and the concerns of general public. If they don't do that, they run the risk of becoming obsolete. You may have seen, for instance, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. There were questions about Keir Starmer coming to the G20 at home. And his explanation was to draw the relevance in terms of bilateral issues that he intends to do whilst he's here. You may have seen same with the European Union. It was combined with bilateral issues just to draw relevance to their participation in this multilateral organization. So that's going to remain an issue that ordinary people keep on measuring the importance of this, how and why should we spend such lots of money. Similarly, here in South Africa, I think the next few months, you're going to hear voices talking about how much did we spend? Was it money well spent? So it's correct to do that. It's correct for the public to do that, for taxpayers to do that, because that helps to keep government on track.
I mean, if we look at the long-term implications of this summit, what do you think they are for South Africa's foreign policy and its role for the Global South?
You know, Katleo, there's one thing that emerged at this conference. It's a consensus. You know, sometimes we confuse consensus with other forms of decision taking. Consensus, it's a process that of decision making by a group, away from taking a vote. But consensus has different implications and different meanings. But the consensus that we're looking at here, that was followed here, is what is called sufficient consensus, which essentially means that you may have a few members who don't agree with the content, or we don't agree entirely with the document that has been negotiated, but are willing to let it go through. They're not willing to obstruct it. That's what is called this sufficient consensus. But if you don't have sufficient consensus, there's one member who objects to that, you're unlikely to get the document. And I think South Africa has done very well to bring Argentina into the fold to sign on this consensus, despite their objection, because the Argentinian understood that they don't want to stay in the way of obstructing the adoption of this. Now, this is very important because the G20, it's an organization of the most powerful economies. And the power of one means a lot, because if you allow votes, you allow decision to be taken by any other form outside consensus, you are likely to see a tyranny of the majority or a tyranny of the most powerful within the G20. So the G20 has set up the bar very high in terms of consensus building and sufficient consensus. You have other forms of consensus in terms of decision making. But I think what South Africa focused on here was quite important. You hear voices now saying, well, Argentina did not agree to it. But my understanding now is that Argentina has signed on this document. And of course, the fact that they are objecting to it, they may not be the only one. You may find the other countries with strong objection to certain things, but they felt that they can't obstruct this. So there's a power of one, and there's a power of consensus in multilateral institutions, except, away from the most powerful determining and directing the agenda of these institutions.
So, Doc, then that would take us to what the next steps should be, not only for South Africa, but for the G20 community in its entirety, in order to ensure that some of these commitments made in this 30-page document are implemented effectively, especially in the context of the USA taking on the presidency.
South Africa will become part of the Troika. South Africa, the United States, the incoming president, they are taking over on the 1st of December. And next year is the United Kingdom. So the three countries would work together in defining the next G20 next year in the United States. And South Africa will make contribution, I'm definitely sure, about what are legacy issues that can be lifted. And that will be a subject of negotiation also moving forward. But the host country will define its agenda. But it can't define its agenda and totally neglect or negate what came out of here. South Africa has lifted up issues around the social summit. It came from Brazil. It's the Brazilian idea. They've infused it into the G20. And I hope the United States will maintain that. But the United States is unlikely to do that, because the United States believe that the state is the centerpiece for decision making and everything must evolve around the state. But the state now involves a lot of role players. And I hope the United States will recognize that. Will recognize the involvement of business and civil society in this. And I hope the United States will take forward also this question of panel of experts. It doesn't have necessarily to be on the question of debt. It can be on any challenging global issue, to get experts who do research and really be able to make a contribution so that heads of state can have an informed debate around these issues, away from divides of political and ideological position, but looking at the facts and the empirical evidence that is presented before them. And I hope that will help to guide the G20 moving forward.
We certainly do hope it's going to be quite an interesting time to be watching out for those engagements between South Africa, the US, and the rest of the bloc. Thank you so much for joining us. That was risk analyst and former diplomat, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela.